Okay, let's unpack this. Last time on the deep dive, we started looking into that huge mystery where English actually came from. We went way back, to the Indo-European roots.
Right, just setting the stage, showing it's part of this massive language family. But that was really just the prologue.
Exactly. So today, we're jumping forward, big jump, time, geography.
Yeah.
We're connecting those ancient roots to the actual island, to Britain, where English started to, well, become something we might recognize.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting.
Our mission for this deep dive is to focus on a truly pivotal time, the arrival of the Germanic peoples. How did that event lead directly to what we call Old English?
We're talking about that really dynamic period right after the Romans pulled out. Lots of upheaval, cultures clashing, languages mixing.
So let's set the scene a bit. Rome's influence in Britain, centuries long, it officially ends around 410 CE. And that departure, it wasn't just political, was it?
No, not at all. It left a huge power vacuum. And you have movements happening all over Europe then, but for Britain, the year 449 CE often comes up.
449. Why that year specifically?
Well, historians often mark it as the sort of traditional start date for the Germanic conquest, or sometimes called the Anglo-Saxon or Teutonic conquest. It's a bit symbolic maybe, but it's a key marker.
And we need to be clear, this wasn't like one single army landing, right?
Yeah.
The sources suggest it was more gradual.
Definitely. Not one unified force. It was different groups, different tribes coming over across the North Sea, settling in different areas over time.
Okay, so who were these main groups?
The sources we looked at consistently point to three main Germanic tribes being the key players in this settlement: the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons.
Jutes, Angles, Saxons. And they came from specific places on the continent.
That's right. The Jutes, generally thought to be from Jutland, modern Denmark, the Angles from Schleswig, and the Saxons from Holstein, both areas in what's now northern Germany.
And the collective name we use, Anglo-Saxons, that comes from.
It comes directly from the Angles and the Saxons, yeah.
Huh.
They seem to have been the largest or most prominent groups settling large parts of the island.
And this movement, it wasn't just happening in isolation towards Britain.
No, it was part of that much bigger picture across Europe, the migration period, roughly 5th to 7th centuries. Lots of movement, tribes shifting around.
Now, why did they come to Britain? Do the sources agree on that?
Not entirely. There are kind of two main narratives you see. One is simply, the Romans left, there was good land, a power vacuum opportunity, they just moved in.
Okay, makes sense. And the other?
The other story, which is quite famous, comes from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This incredibly important early history, written in Old English itself.
Right.
It says, under the year 449, that a British king, Vortigern, actually invited some of these people, specifically Angles, led by Hengist and Horsa, according to tradition as mercenaries,
Invited them to do what?
to help fight off the Picts, who were raiding down from the north. The deal supposedly was land in the southeast in return for military service.
Huh. So maybe invited, maybe opportunistic, maybe a bit of both.
Probably a mix, realistically. But the end result was the same. A really significant migration of Germanic-speaking people into Britain.
And this is the crucial point for the language. What happened to the people already living there, the Celtic Britons?
Yeah, well, it's a pretty harsh story, according to the sources. In the areas the Germanic tribes took over, the Britons weren't generally assimilated.
So not a blending of peoples.
Not really, no. The accounts suggest they were largely pushed out, driven west towards Wales and Cornwall, north towards Cumbria or into Scotland. Or, in the areas that became England, the sources suggest quite brutal policies, extermination or enslavement.
Wow. That's dark.
It is, and this displacement or lack of large-scale mixing is absolutely key to understanding something surprising about early English.
Which is?
The very limited influence of the native Celtic languages on Old English vocabulary. It's remarkably small.
You'd think living side by side there'd be loads of borrowed words, wouldn't you?
You would expect that in many context situations. But here, the sources suggest the scale of displacement, or maybe the social divide, meant the Germanic languages didn't absorb much from British Celtic.
Except for place names.
Exactly. That's the main area. Rivers, hills, settlements that already had names. Thames, London, York, Leeds, Lincoln. Names the newcomers presumably learned and kept using. Even some regions like Buckinghamshire, Leicestershire echo older Celtic connections.
So we see glimpses of the pre-existing culture in things like, say, that intricate Celtic mirror artifact, but their everyday language didn't really feed into English much?
Very little in terms of core vocabulary. There were some later borrowings, especially religious terms coming via Irish missionaries, like the word cross. But the basic word stock remained overwhelmingly Germanic.
Okay, so these Jutes, Angles, and Saxons arrive, they settle, they bring their languages. You said they were related dialects.
Yes, all part of the West Germanic branch. Different, but close enough that they would have been, mutually intelligible to a large degree.
Like different regional accents or dialects today, maybe?
Sort of. Maybe a bit more distinct than just accents, but close enough for basic communication. Think perhaps differences like modern Scots and English, or maybe Dutch and German related, some shared roots, but definitely distinct.
And then what happened? These dialects just existed side by side.
No, this is where the linguistic magic, if you like, happens. As these groups lived together, interacted, intermarried over generations across these new kingdoms.
They started to merge.
Exactly. Their dialects began to influence each other, borrow from each other, level out some differences. And slowly, over a few centuries, this blend started to form a distinct language. Not quite Jutish, not quite Anglian, not quite Saxon, but something new.
And that new language was?
Old English. Though it's important to remember, even Old English wasn't uniform. The sources point to maybe 3 or 4 major regional dialects still existing within it.
Okay, and you mentioned the Angles were maybe the biggest group. Is that why we call it English?
That seems to be the reason, yes. Because the Angles were perhaps the most numerous, or held sway over large territories, their name got attached to the whole area and the developing language.
So England comes
From Old English Englaland, literally land of the Angles.
on the language.
It became known as Englisk, which just meant, the language spoken by the Anglican, the English people.
And when did these terms England and English really become common?
They start appearing more consistently later on, particularly in the late 9th century. This is strongly associated with Alfred the Great and his efforts.
Alfred again. We'll come back to him. But first, this settlement led to kingdoms, right? Not just one big England straight away.
Oh, absolutely not. The settlers carved out numerous territories, which eventually coalesced into larger kingdoms. This leads to that period historians call the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy.
The 7 kingdoms.
Yeah, although the number wasn't always exactly 7 and the power shifted, but roughly you had major players like Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. Constant rivals sometimes, but they formed the political map of England for centuries.
And what about society inside these kingdoms? How was it structured?
Well, early on, sources suggest a clearer line between free men, ceorls, and slaves, or serfs, the Marios. Over time, though, as warrior leaders gained land and power, a sort of gentry or nobility emerged.
Lords and things.
Right. And many free men became dependent on these lords. Governance evolved, too, from tribal councils towards kingship, with the king advised by a council of nobles, the Witan. And crucially, they developed a pretty organized administrative system.
How so?
The land was divided up. You had shires run by an earl or ealdorman. Shires were divided into hundreds and then into towns or villages. Each level had courts and legal structures. It was becoming quite systematic.
And then out of these often competing kingdoms came unification. You mentioned Alfred the Great.
Yes, Alfred, King of Wessex in the late 9th century, is such a pivotal figure. He didn't just defend Wessex against Viking invasions, which were a huge threat then.
Right, the Vikings were arriving too.
They were, but Alfred went on the offensive. Starting around 886, he began to gain control over other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, pushing back the Vikings. He becomes seen as the first real king of the Anglo-Saxons. He's often called the Father of England. You still see statues commemorating him.
But he wasn't just a military leader.
Far from it. His cultural impact was immense. He was a huge advocate for learning and literacy in English. He learned Latin himself, quite late in life, apparently.
In English, not Latin.
Yes, that was the key thing. He organized this amazing project to translate important works history, like Bede's ecclesiastical history, philosophy, religious texts from Latin into Old English, specifically the West Saxon dialect of his kingdom.
Why was that so important?
It elevated English. It made it a language of scholarship, of record, of literature, not just everyday chat. It helped standardize the written form, at least in Wessex. And he commissioned the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that year-by-year history, in Old English, the first of its kind for a European nation in its own tongue.
So he really cemented English as a written literary language.
Absolutely. And his successors, people like Edward the Elder, Aethelstan, who's arguably the first king of a truly united England after defeating the last Viking kingdom in York, they continued building on that foundation.
Consolidating the kingdom.
Yes, and fighting off more Norse threats. By the time of Edgar the Peaceful, around 973, England had this quite sophisticated administration shires, sheriffs managing them for the king, a tax system. Compared to, say, France at the time, England was remarkably centralized and well-governed.
Okay, so that's the historical backdrop.
Yeah.
Let's zoom back into the language itself, Old English. You said it was really different from modern English.
Oh, profoundly different. If you heard it spoken, you probably wouldn't recognize it as English. The pronunciation, the spelling, which wasn't standardized anyway, much of the vocabulary, and especially the grammar.
Grammar was the big one.
It was what linguists call a synthetic language. Modern English is much more analytic.
Synthetic versus analytic, what does that mean?
Basically, a synthetic language uses word endings and inflections to show grammatical relationships. Who did what to whom, possession, plurals, all that. An analytic language uses word order and helper words like prepositions, to, from, with, and auxiliary verbs, do, have, will.
So Old English relied on changing the ends of words.
Heavily. Nouns didn't just have singular and plural forms. They had different endings for grammatical case, nominative for the subject, accusative for the direct object, genitive for possession, dative for the indirect object, or after certain prepositions. Some sources reckon a noun could have up to 8 different forms depending on case and number. Plus, nouns had grammatical gender, masculine, feminine, neuter, which often had nothing to do with biology. The word for woman, with man, was actually masculine grammatically.
That's bizarre.
It seems so to us. Adjectives also has complex endings to agree with the nouns they modified, and verbs had more complex conjugations than today. It's a system much more like modern German or Latin in structure. Modern English has lost almost all of that inflection.
Okay, that sounds way more complex grammatically. What are the words themselves, the vocabulary?
A lot of the core was Germanic, obviously. Many basic everyday words we still use trace back directly: man, wife, house, eat, drink, go, strong, good, often short, single-syllable words. But a huge amount of Old English vocabulary has been lost, replaced later.
How do they make new words?
Compounding was really common, sticking 2 words together to make a new concept. Think of those poetic examples from Beowulf, like calling the sea the whale road, Horn Rad, or the sun sky's candle, Hilafan candle, very descriptive.
Beowulf. That's the big famous work from this time, isn't it?
It's the longest and most significant epic poem, yes. Really important. Even though the story is set in Scandinavia, it tells us so much about Anglo-Saxon culture, their values of heroism, loyalty, the sense of fate or word, this world full of monsters and struggle, and it survives in that West Saxon dialect Alfred promoted.
And the other key text was the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle.
Right. That ongoing history, written by monks in monasteries over centuries in Old English, it's our main narrative source for so much of this period from their perspective.
So if we sum up the language itself, Old English, born from these blended Germanic dialects, was grammatically complex, synthetic, lots of word endings, more like German, structurally.
And very different from the analytic, word order dependent language English eventually became. That shift is one of the major stories in the history of English.
It really is. This deep dive shows just how foundational this period was, how these tribes shaped not just the land, but the very structure of the language that would become English. But it makes you think. If Old English was so complex, so synthetic, relying on all those endings like German still does, what happened? What forces caused it to shed almost all of that complexity over the following centuries? Was it just destined to simplify, or did specific events, specific pressures actively push English towards the more analytic structure we recognize today?
That's a fantastic question. It really gets you thinking about why languages change, doesn't it? Are there internal drifts, or is it external shocks?
And those external forces, those next big shocks to the system after the Anglo-Saxons laid the groundwork? Well, that's exactly where we're heading next time.
Right, the story definitely doesn't end here. The Vikings and then the Normans are waiting in the wings.
Building on this Germanic base, we'll explore how those influences the Vikings, and crucially, the Norman conquest profoundly reshaped English yet again.
Yeah, those events had a massive, massive impact on the language.
So don't forget to tune in next time, when we'll explore the external influences on Old English. You won't want to miss it. Join us then.